Chapter 1. The Stranger in the Stacks. It was nearly closing time at the Mariners' Reach Public Library, and the warm glow of the setting sun filtered through the tall windows, casting golden light across rows of untouched poetry books. Clara Evans stood on her tiptoes, reaching to straighten a crooked spine on the top shelf, humming quietly to herself. The library was her sanctuary, a quiet world of paper and dreams where nothing unexpected ever happened. Until today. She first noticed him out of the corner of her eye, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood half up despite the summer heat. Tattoos snaked down his arms in intricate, swirling patterns, and a silver ring glinted on his brow. He hovered near the poetry section, his back to her, fingers grazing the spines with an oddly careful reverence, like he was afraid they might shatter under his touch. Clara hesitated. The library didn't get many visitors who looked like they'd walked out of a war crime novel. He didn't look like someone who wandered in by accident, though he was searching for something, and then he found it. She watched as he pulled out a worn volume of Pablo Neruda's collected poems and held it in both hands. He stood motionless for a long moment, then opened it slowly, flipping pages with a kind of quiet ache that made Clara's chest tighten for reasons she couldn't explain. He didn't sit or browse further. He simply closed the book again, walked to the counter, and handed it to her without a word. Their eyes met. His were a stormy grey, framed by lashes to long for someone with a jaw that looked like it had taken and given its fair share of punches. Clara tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She scanned the book and slid it across the counter. "Due in 2 weeks, she said, her voice softer than usual. He nodded once, took the book, and turned to leave. "Wait," Clara called, surprising herself. He paused mid-step. She swallowed and motioned to the book. "That one's special." His mouth twitched into the faintest curve, something like amusement, or maybe appreciation. "I know," he murmured, his voice deep, gravelly, but unexpectedly gentle. "It saved me once." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving only the echo of his boots and the scent of ink and leather in his wake. Curious, Clara glanced at the poetry shelf. The spot where he had taken the Neruda book held a surprise, a piece of folded paper, carefully wedged between 2 books. She pulled it free and unfolded it, dotting clean, steady handwriting. A single line of verse stared back at her. "I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees." Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the paper to her chest. The stranger hadn't just come for poetry. He had come for something else, and something told her he would be back. Chapter 2. Ink and whispers. Clara wasn't sure what she expected the next day, but when she unlocked the library's front doors at precisely 9 o'clock, her heart carried a strange anticipation, like the pages of a book she couldn't wait to turn. But the tattooed stranger didn't come. Not that day, not the next. By the 3rd morning, she began to feel ridiculous. She buried herself in cataloguing, shelving, and reorganizing the poetry section, anything to quiet the flutter that rose every time the front bell jingled. Then, on Friday afternoon, he returned. He didn't announce himself. One moment the library was quiet. The next, he was standing at the poetry shelf again, dressed in worn jeans and a black Henley that clung to the ink sprawled across his arms like wild vines. He didn't look at her. He just reached for another book, this time Mary Oliver, and opened it with that same strange reverence. Clara didn't approach him. She let him linger in silence until he finally made his way to the counter. "I like the line you left," she said casually, trying to keep her hands from fidgeting with the edge of the desk. He met her gaze. "Neruda speaks to something raw. Do you leave quotes at every library you visit?" she asked, half smiling. "Only the ones that feel like they'd understand." She wasn't sure if that meant her or the building, but either way, her heart skipped a beat. He extended the new book. "I'm Dante." The name felt heavy and poetic all at once, like something carved into stone. "I'm Clara." A quiet moment passed between them. Then Dante shifted slightly, a flicker of discomfort behind his eyes. "I don't talk much," he admitted, "but I read poetry. It says things I don't know how to." Clara softened. "Well, You're always welcome here, even if you don't say a word." He gave her a nod of thanks, then slipped the Oliver volume under his arm and turned to leave. But this time, he didn't go far. For the next week, he came back every couple of days, always to the poetry section. Sometimes he sat in the farthest corner, silently flipping pages. Other times, he'd sketch in a small, black notebook that he never let anyone see. Clara watched from a distance, intrigued. She noticed things, how he only touched the books with clean hands, how he never looked anyone in the eye except her, and how his expression shifted just slightly whenever he read something that moved him. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, she finally found another note tucked between the pages of an 𝐬𝐿𝐫𝐽𝐬's collection. It was folded like the first and slipped just beneath her favorite poem. This time, the quote read, "It takes courage to grow up and become who you really are." Clara closed the book gently, her fingertips brushing the page like it was something sacred. Dante Reyes, the man cloaked in shadows and ink, was starting to speak, not in words, but in verse. Chapter 3. A name etched in shadow. Saturday brought with it the sleepy rhythm Clara adored. Slow readers in cozy corners, the soft patter of rain on the skylights, and the comforting scent of warm paper. But the peace fractured when she stepped out to grab coffee from the cafe across the street. As she waited in line, two men sat at a nearby table, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. "Dante Reyes is back in town," one muttered, glancing around as if the name alone summoned danger. Clara froze. The second man shook his head. "Heard he's still tied to the 𝐿𝐫𝐫𝐿. Used to be their ink guy, real artist, but dangerous. Got into some heavy business a while back. Nearly killed a guy. Yeah, I heard he disappeared for a couple years. Nobody knows why he's back now." Clara's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She returned to the library in a fog, the warm walls and quiet stacks, now feeling strangely colder. When Dante walked in just before closing, she couldn't stop the chill that ran down her spine. He offered a quiet hello, placed a 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭 volume on the desk, and waited. Clara looked at the tattoos swirling down his arm, shades of black and ash, with delicate, deliberate strokes that hinted at mastery. She had thought them beautiful. Now, she wondered what stories they covered. "Dante," she began, carefully, "what does your work involve?" He didn't flinch, but his jaw tensed. "You heard something I overheard. People talk." A pause. "I'm a tattooist," he said, voice low. "That much is true, and the rest." He glanced out the window, rain streaking the glass like veins. "I used to be their artist. The serpents, I inked them, earned their respect. And yeah, I've done things I'm not proud of, but I've never touched a civilian, never hurt someone who didn't come looking for pain." His eyes met hers, grey and unflinching. No excuses, just the weight of a life etched in shadows. "I'm not that man anymore," he added, "but I carry him with me." Clara hesitated. The safe thing to do would be to pull back, put up a wall and protect the quiet world she had so carefully built. But instead, she reached for the library stamp and gently stamped the return date into the Bukowski volume. "Poetry seems to like you," she said softly. A flicker of something passed through Dante's eyes, surprise, maybe even gratitude. He gave a small nod, took the book, and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he turned back. "I'm trying," he said, "to be someone different." And for the first time, Clara realized something startling. So was she. Chapter 4. Chapters of the past library had become their quiet meeting ground, a place where neither of them had to be anything but present. It started with simple greetings, then stretched into hushed conversations, tucked between book spines and whispered across the circulation desk, on a cool afternoon scented with fresh rain and old pages. Clara found herself shelving a new poetry collection when Dante appeared beside her. He didn't speak at first, just knelt to help her with the lower shelf, their shoulders brushing lightly in the narrow aisle. "Ever think books are safer than people?" he asked, voice rough around the edges, but low, thoughtful. Clara chuckled under her breath. "Books don't lie, or leave." Dante looked at her for a long beat, then returned his gaze to the floor. "I used to read to escape," he said. Grew up in a neighborhood where escaping meant survival. My mom worked 2 jobs. My dad didn't stick around. Found poetry in a dumpster behind an old school once. Rain-soaked pages. Neruda, actually. Clara paused, surprised. That's how it started, he nodded. It was the first time I read something that made me feel like I wasn't a mistake. There was something in his voice, a softness that unraveled the steel in his frame. Clara leaned against the nearby cart. I was supposed to be married, she said quietly. 4 years ago. He left 3 weeks before the wedding. Said I was safe, not passionate enough for the life he wanted. Dante looked up at her, the vulnerability in his eyes mirroring her own. I became small after that, Clara continued. Built a world where nothing could surprise me. They stood in silence for a moment, to people stitched with old wounds, finally letting the seams show. Dante reached into his back pocket and pulled out his notebook. Without a word, he tore a page from it and handed it to her. On it, in precise block letters, was a short stanza. The world called me broken, but your silence held no judgment, only space enough to breathe. Clara read it twice, then pressed it to her chest. You wrote this? He nodded, almost shyly. I think, she said, looking up at him. Books might not be safer than people after all. And for the first time since her heart had broken, Clara felt something stir, not fear, but the fragile beginning of trust. Chapter 5. Coffee and in Clara had never been to that part of town before, not at night, at least. The streets were narrower, the streetlights dimmer, and the buildings bore stories in their crumbling brick. She hesitated outside the tattoo studio with the flickering neon sign, 𝐟𝐨𝐫𝐿 Inc. The invitation had come casually. Dante had stopped by the library just before closing and, after a brief silence, asked, Want to see where the poetry ends up? Now, standing outside, heart tapping a nervous rhythm in her chest, she pushed the door open. Inside was nothing like she expected. No skulls, no flames, no hard rock pounding through the speakers. Instead, soft classical music played in the background, and the scent of sandalwood filled the air. The walls were lined not just with tattoo designs, but framed poetry excerpts, Langston Hughes, 𝐼𝐸𝐴, Sylvia Plath, each paired with delicate ink sketches. Dante looked up from his sketchpad behind the counter. His dark hair was slightly tousled, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing arms covered in fine, intricate artwork. When he saw her, something in his expression softened. You came. I wasn't sure I would, Clara admitted. I'm glad you did. He gestured to a tall stool near his workbench. Want to see something? She nodded and sat down, watching as he pulled out a thick, leather-bound sketchbook. The pages were filled with designs, tattoos, yes, but also illustrations paired with stanzas of poetry, handwritten in precise script. He turned to a recent page, a figure curled beneath a tree, leaves forming words above them. Your favorite poem, he said quietly. The one you read to the kids last week during story hour. Clara blinked in surprise. You were there, just in the back. Didn't want to interrupt. She traced the page with gentle fingers, speechless. You see the ink, Dante murmured. But no one sees the stories, the reasons people get them. Some want to forget, some want to remember, and me, I just want to feel something that doesn't hurt. Clara looked around again. There was so much softness hidden in the sharp edges. Her gaze settled on a wall filled with tiny sketches, feathers, open books, stars, and fragments of poetry etched around them. I thought tattoo studios were supposed to be intimidating, she said. He smiled faintly. Mine's a little different. They sipped coffee from mismatched mugs he'd pulled from a dusty cupboard, talking about favorite authors and the rhythm of words. When she laughed at a comment he made about Bukowski being too drunk to trust, Dante stared for a second longer than necessary. What? She asked. You laugh like you don't get to do it very often. Clara looked down into her mug. I don't. He leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. That should change. She felt warmth bloom in her chest, slow and steady. It didn't feel dangerous or rushed. It felt safe, like an old book rediscovered and opened again, one page at a time. And in that quiet studio, filled with ink and poems, something delicate unfolded between them. Not love, not yet, but something close, something like possibility. Chapter 6. Town Whispers. Mariners Reach was the kind of place where change stirred gossip faster than the wind stirred leaves. Clara had lived here long enough to know that people noticed everything, especially when it didn't fit into their neatly folded lives. It started with glances. Then came the questions disguised as concern. "Clara, dear, that man who's been visiting the library, he's not a relative, is he?" Mrs. Templeton, the elderly patron who always borrowed cookbooks but never cooked, asked over the returns desk with a raised brow. Then Margaret from the town council stopped Clara mid-aisle. "Are you comfortable with him around? I mean, with his background and all?" Clara smiled politely, nodded, but inside, unease took root. The final blow came during staff lunch. Lisa, her co-worker and friend, leaned over and whispered, "I know you're an adult and all, but Dante Reyes, people talk. I just don't want you to get hurt. You've been through enough." Clara didn't respond, not right away. Instead, she went about her day cataloguing books, answering questions, shelving donations, while her thoughts spun in circles. She told herself it didn't matter what anyone thought, but it did, and that realization stung more than she expected. That evening, Dante showed up just before closing, a poetry book in one hand and a small, clear-wrapped object in the other. "I brought something," he said quietly. "For you." She raised an eyebrow. "It's a bookmark," he added, almost sheepishly. Inside the wrapping was a thin strip of leather etched with fine detail, a library stamp, an open book, and a single word, "belonging." Clara's throat tightened. "I've been hearing things," she said, unable to meet his eyes. "About you. About who you were. People in town. They're concerned." Dante was still. He didn't defend himself right away. He simply looked down, jaw clenched, as if bracing for a blow. "People will always talk," he said eventually, "especially in towns like this. I can't change their memories. But I'm not hiding. Not anymore. You've changed," she said. Softly, "I'm trying to," he murmured. "But I don't need saving, Clara. I just need space to be more than who I used to be." Her eyes met his then, and what she saw there beneath the shadows, beyond the tattoos, was a man fighting quietly, stubbornly, to be better. She stepped closer and placed the bookmark in the poetry book he'd borrowed. "You're welcome here. That won't change." Outside, the sky was dusted with stars. The whispers would continue, Clara knew, but for the first time, she didn't feel afraid of them, because sometimes the bravest stories weren't the loudest. Sometimes they were whispered in ink and carved into leather by hands that once knew only how to break, but now chose to create. Chapter 7. The storm inside it started with silence. Dante hadn't come by the library in 3 days. Clara told herself it meant nothing. He was busy, maybe working late at his studio, but her chest carried the weight of something unspoken. Each day she glanced toward the poetry shelves, half expecting to find another folded note, but there was nothing. Just empty space, where his presence used to linger. By the 5th day, the worrying pressed harder. She walked to raise ink after closing, umbrella barely shielding her from the heavy rain. The lights inside were off, the windows dark. A paper taped to the door read simply, "Closed until further notice." Her breath caught, panic stirred, not loud, but deep, a tight coil in her stomach. She turned away, trying not to imagine the worst. But the stories she'd overheard, the whispers of Dante's past, of the violence tied to his name, played louder in her mind now. It wasn't until late evening on the 7th day that the bell above the library's door chimed, and he stepped inside. Clara looked up from the front desk and froze. He was drenched from the rain, hoodie soaked through, his face pale and jaw tight. A faint cut traced the side of his cheek, and there was a stiffness to the way he walked, as if each step cost him something. "Dante," she whispered, rushing around the desk. "What happened?" "Just unfinished business," he muttered, eyes flicking away. "It's over now." She took his hand without thinking, guiding him into the back room where they kept the stove kettle and emergency supplies. She found a towel and pressed it into his hands, then sat him down with shaking fingers. He winced as she knelt beside him, gently dabbing at the dried blood on his cheek. "Don't lie to me," she said, voice trembling. "Not with your silence." His eyes finally met hers, exhausted, bloodshot, and brimming with something he rarely let anyone see. "I didn't want you to see me like this," he confessed. "Not when I was doing everything to be different." Clara swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "You don't have to be perfect, just present." He laughed under his breath, a bitter, hollow sound. "Present is dangerous." But then she reached up and rested her palm against his jaw, soft and steady. "You came back," she said. "That's all I care about." And for the first time, he let her in, not with words, but with the way he leaned into her touch, the way his head bowed ever so slightly, like a man finally allowing himself to rest. His forehead came to rest against hers, breath mingling in the quiet space between them. No declarations, no promises, just the unspoken ache of two broken people finding comfort, warmth, and the fragile beginning of healing. In each other's arms. Chapter 8. Poetry in the dark storm knocked out power. Just before sundown, the library went still, wrapped in hushed shadows and flickering candlelight. Clara lit a few emergency lanterns and set them on tables, their soft glow casting golden halos over the shelves. Rain pounded steadily on the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance like an ancient heartbeat. She didn't expect anyone to come in. Most of the town was tucked away indoors, and she was only staying late to finish inventory. But then footsteps. Heavy, familiar, measured. Dante appeared in the doorway, his hood pushed back, dark curls damp from the rain. He held up a flashlight, but turned it off as soon as he stepped inside. "You're open?" he asked, lips curved slightly in surprise. Clara gave a gentle shrug. "Only for those who come bearing poetry." He smiled, really smiled, and the sight lit something inside her. She brought him a blanket from the reading nook and a cup of hot tea, and together they sat in the poetry section, surrounded by candlelight and the soft scent of old paper and sandalwood. Dante pulled a slim book from his coat pocket and turned it slowly in his hands. He looked nervous and certain in a way she hadn't seen before. "I wrote something," he said finally. "It's not polished." "I don't care," Clara whispered. He unfolded the paper and began to read. "You don't ask for more, only sit with the storm until it softens into rain. In your silence, I find myself brave." Clara's breath caught. The words were raw and vulnerable, like exposed skin. And in that moment, he wasn't the feared tattooist or the guarded stranger, he was just a man, aching to be seen. "I didn't know you could write like that," she said softly. "I didn't either," he replied. "Not until you." Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the library in a brief silver glow. Then darkness again, warm, close. They sat in the quiet hum of rain and candlelight, side by side, knees nearly touching. Clara turned to him slowly. "I think I was waiting for someone like you," she murmured. "Someone who speaks not with noise, but with meaning." His eyes searched hers, the silence between them stretching like a thread pulled taut. And then gently, hesitantly, Dante leaned in. Their lips met in the softest kiss, no urgency. Just a quiet question, and its tender answer. His hand rested against her cheek, thumb brushing her skin, Eve memorizing her presence. When they parted, she stayed close, forehead resting against his. "I've never kissed someone in a library during a blackout," she whispered. He chuckled, low and warm. "I've never had someone listen to my poems before." They stayed that way for a while, wrapped in candlelight and the soft thunder of possibility, as the storm raged gently on outside forgotten. Chapter 9. Old Scars. New promise. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the library, soft and golden, casting quiet warmth over the worn wooden floors. Clara was rearranging the children's corner when Dante walked in, not with his usual careful steps, but with a sense of quiet purpose. He carried a small paper bag in one hand and wore a comb, almost shy smile. Clara's heart fluttered at the sight of him. After the blackout night, something between them had shifted unspoken, but deeply felt. "I brought muffins," he said, placing the bag on the counter. "Figured we could trade carbs for conversation." She smiled, tempting offer. "I'm easily swayed by pastries." They sat in the break room, sipping coffee, the scent of cinnamon and sugar hanging in the air. Conversation flowed more freely now. Books, memories, favorite colors, worst jobs, but there was something heavier between them, waiting to be spoken. Dante finally reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He laid it on the table like a quiet offering. Clara unfolded it slowly. A simple sketch greeted her, an open book, its pages turning into birds mid-flight. Beneath it was a line of text, "Even the broken can learn to fly." "I want it here," he said, tapping the inside of his forearm, already inked with layers of history. Over one of the old ones. Clara looked at him, her eyes softening. "That's my favorite line. From The Wind in the Willows, I remember. You read it aloud the day that little boy had a meltdown during story hour. You said it saved you as a kid." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Will you do it?" he asked. "Pick the font. Sit with me while I ink it in." She nodded slowly. Yes, of course. That afternoon, she visited 𝐟𝐸𝐫𝐿 for the second time. This time, not as a guest, but as part of something more. She sat beside him, their fingers brushing, as the machine buzzed softly and he worked over his own skin with steady hands, layering meaning over memory. "I want a life beyond this," Dante said quietly, "beyond the noise, the shadows. You make me want that." Clara didn't speak. She simply reached out, linking her pinky with his, grounding him in the moment. Later, as the tatter healed, beneath the clean bandage, they stood in the doorway of the studio, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky blazed with pink and amber, a watercolor painting in motion. "Leaving the gang won't be easy," Dante said. "But I'm done being just a name in someone else's story. I want to write my own." Clara turned to him. "Then write it, and let me be part of it." He took her hand in his rough, calloused, but trembling slightly, and for the first time, she felt not just hope. She felt the start of something enduring, a promise, ink not on skin, but somewhere deeper. Chapter 10. A threat returns. The library had never felt so fragile. Clara was shelving new arrivals when the phone call came. It wasn't the words that chilled her, it was the voice, low and cold, wrapped in familiarity. She didn't want. "You don't know who you're letting into your life, librarian," the voice sneered. "But I do. Keep playing with fire, and you'll get burnt." Then silence. Clara stood there, the receiver still pressed to her ear long after the line went dead. Her breath came shallow, her pulse loud in her ears. The threat wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, calculated, and terrifying. She locked the doors early that day. When Dante arrived that evening, she met him at the door, arms crossed tightly across her chest. The sight of him, familiar and warm, almost broke her resolve, but the fear simmering inside didn't let go. "We need to talk," she said, voice tense. Inside, Dante followed her, sensing the shift instantly. "Someone called," Clara said, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound strong. "They knew your name, knew mine. They told me to stay away from you." Dante's jaw clenched, his body going still as stone. He didn't speak for a long moment. "Tell me the truth," Clara whispered. "Are you really free of them? Of the gang?" "I'm trying," he said, his voice rough. "But leaving doesn't come with a clean break. Some of them think I know too much. Others think I'm weak for walking away. So I'm a target now. Because I cared about you." "No," he said firmly. "Because they know I care about you." Her breath caught. "Clara, I would never let anything happen to you," he continued, stepping closer. "But I can't lie, I brought danger with me, even if I didn't mean to. And that's why maybe." She raised a hand, stopping him. "Don't say it. Don't say we should walk away. I just want you safe." "And I want you safe," she replied, her voice shaking. "But maybe safety isn't the most important thing anymore." For a moment, The room was filled only with the sound of the rain tapping gently against the windows. Clara stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of his jacket. "I chose this, Dante. I chose you. But you need to decide now, are you going to keep running from the life you want, or are you going to fight for it?" He looked down at her, this quiet, fierce woman who saw the broken pieces of him and still stayed. And something shifted behind his eyes. "I'll fight," he said, barely above a whisper. "For you, for us. I'll burn every bridge to be free if it means there's still a path to you." She nodded, then pulled him into her arms, her cheek pressed against his chest, listening to the storm within him begin to calm. Outside, the world was dark, but inside something was beginning to glow. Chapter 11. Inked. Goodbye. The studio was quiet. Too quiet. Dante sat alone at his workbench, staring down at a tattoo machine he hadn't picked up in days. The decision weighed heavy, but he knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep dragging Clara into the shadows of his past, no matter how much light she brought into his life. Some corners refused to be illuminated. The threats hadn't stopped. If anything, they had escalated. Anonymous messages, a slashed tire, a stranger lingering too long near the library. And Clara was trying to stay strong, but he could see it in her eyes, the fear, the weight. He couldn't stand to be the reason her peace unraveled. That night, he packed a small duffel, just the essentials. No note to the gang, no explanations, just silence. But for Clara, he left something different. At the library, after hours, he slipped in through the side entrance he knew so well. The poetry section was still, like a church made of ink and memory. He found the book they'd shared on their first night of reading together, Pablo Neruda, selected poems, and carefully tucked a folded letter inside. Then, without a sound, he left. The next morning, Clara arrived early. The library felt wrong, as if someone had taken all the color out of the place. She moved through her tasks distractedly, her eyes drifting toward the door, hoping to see Dante's silhouette appear as it always did. But he didn't come. He didn't come the next day, or the one after. By the fourth day, something inside her broke. She wandered to the poetry shelves, drawn by something she couldn't name. Her fingers traced familiar spines until she paused at the Neruda volume. With trembling hands, she pulled it free and the letter fell into her lap. She unfolded it slowly. "Clara, I wish I had better words, the right ones. But words are your gift, not mine. You made me believe I could be something else, that I wasn't just what the world had carved into me. But the past doesn't let go easily, and I won't let it drag you down with. Emmy, you deserve a love that doesn't come with warning signs. I'm sorry for leaving like this. But maybe one day, when I've finally earned peace, I'll find my way back to you. Until then, thank you for showing me what light feels like." Dante's letter slipped from her hands as the tears came. She didn't sob or scream. She just sat there, surrounded by the books they'd shared, the poetry that had connected them, her heart aching in a way she hadn't felt in years. He was gone, but the words remained, and somehow, she knew, they would lead her forward even if her heart had to learn to turn each page without him. Chapter 12. When words are all that's left. It was the quiet that made her miss him most, not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of presence lost, the hush where his footsteps used to echo between the aisles, where his breath used to linger near the poetry shelves. The library felt different now, hollow in places only Clara could feel. A week passed, then two, and still no sign of Dante. The letter she had found in the Neruda book was folded neatly and tucked into her cardigan pocket, as if carrying his words might tether him to her just a little longer. One grey morning, after shelving the new arrivals with little thought, Clara stood at the edge of the front desk and stared out the window, rain blurring the world outside. Something inside her ached for movement, for proof she hadn't imagined it all. She needed to see the place he'd disappeared from. 𝐟𝐨𝐫𝐿 was still shuttered, the closed until further notice sign curling at the edges from wind and weather. Clara unlocked the side door with the key he had once pressed into her hand and stepped inside. Dust lingered in the air, and the studio carried the scent of ink and wood polish. Everything was just as he'd left it, sketchbooks stacked neatly, The stool by the workbench turned slightly askew. But one thing was different. The far wall, once bare, was now covered in ink and verse. A mural stretched across the plaster like a living poem. Black and grey illustrations, feathers, stars, books, cherry blossoms wrapped around lines of handwritten poetry. Some she recognized, others she didn't, but the ones in the center stopped her breath. "You were the page I never meant to write, the ink that softened the edges of the blade." The silence between stanzas that finally felt like home. Her hand flew to her mouth. It was for her. All of it. Dante had left more than words in that studio. He'd left pieces of his heart. That night, Clara returned to the library with a fire she hadn't felt in weeks. She dug through the archives, organized dusty boxes, and pulled out a long-forgotten flyer template for community nights. She rebranded it Poetry After Hours. The first event was quiet. A handful of locals, some curious teens, a retired teacher, and Clara herself, standing in front of a small display with her hands shaking and her heart open wide. She read Dante's poem aloud, the one from the mural. When she looked up, the room was silent, moved, changed. And in that moment, she realized Dante may have left, but he hadn't vanished. He had simply become part of the space between the words, and as long as she spoke them, he would never truly be gone. Chapter 13. The return. It was a Thursday evening, the kind where the sky hung low and golden over Mariner's Reach, casting long shadows through the library's windows. Clara stood at the front of the room, preparing for the 6th Poetry After Hours gathering. What had started as a tribute to loss had slowly become a celebration of connection. More people came each week, sharing verses, bearing stories, leaning into the quiet comfort of words. But tonight, as she set out chairs and lit the string lights over the poetry corner, her hands trembled a little more than usual. Because deep down, she always looked for him. Not just in the doorway, but in the crowd, in the hush between lines of verse, in the cadence of every poem that reminded her of a gravel-edged voice reading Neruda by candlelight. So when she saw the figure standing in the back hall, still, hoodie damp from the light rain outside, her breath caught in her throat. He was thinner, paler, a little older in the eyes, but it was him. Dante. He didn't come forward. He simply stood there, arms crossed over his chest, face unreadable, as if he didn't quite trust the world to let him belong. Clara's heart thundered as she opened the evening, the way she always did by reading a poem. She reached for the dog-eared copy of Neruda and opened to the one she had chosen days ago. Not knowing why, her voice trembled at first, then steadied. "I love you as certain dark things are to be loved, in secret, between the shadow and the soul." When she looked up, his eyes met hers across the room. They didn't smile, they didn't cry, they simply saw. After the gathering ended, the others drifted out, one by one. Clara stayed behind, pretending to tidy up, hands nervously smoothing over books that didn't need rearranging. Dante stayed where he was, and then, finally, he moved, slow steps, quiet ones, until he stood in front of her, soaked in the soft lamplight and the scent of old paper. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said, voice rough, uncertain. "I wasn't sure you ever would be," she replied. He looked down, then pulled something from his coat pocket, a small folded piece of paper. Without speaking, he handed it to her. Clara opened it. A short stanza, scrawled in his now familiar handwriting. "Left doesn't always mean lost. Some things find their way home quietly, like breath in the space between verses." She read it 3 times, tears gathering at the edges of her vision. Then she looked up and whispered, "Welcome home, Dante." And for the first time in a long time, he smiled, not with his mouth, with his eyes. Hope, stitched into silence. Love, returning on ink-stained wings. Chapter 14. Beneath the inked poetry section was exactly as he remembered it, warm, quiet, and dusted in golden light from the reading lamp Clara always kept on. Even when the rest of the library slept, Dante stood at the end of the aisle, his hand grazing the edge of the shelf, as if afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too quickly. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, back against the wall, a half-opened book resting in her lap. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, her expression soft, calm, but unreadable. "Can I sit?" he asked, voice low. She nodded, and he folded himself onto the floor across from her, close enough to feel her warmth, far enough to leave her space. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The silence between them was not heavy this time, but delicate, like breath held between the beats of a poem. "I didn't know if I could come back," he finally said. Clara closed the book gently. "And yet here you are. I thought walking away would protect you, that it would erase what I brought into your life." She met his gaze. "You didn't bring darkness, Dante. You brought truth. You brought poetry." His mouth twitched into a quiet, almost embarrassed smile. "I left the serpents for good," he said. "It took time. A lot of time. I worked a job across the state. Clean money. Kept to myself. I told myself I'd come back when I was someone new." "And are you?" she asked softly. He hesitated. Then, "No, I'm not new. I'm just more honest. I carry what I've done, but I carry what you gave me, too." Her breath hitched. "And what was that?" "A reason to change. Not for you, but because you made me believe I could." Clara leaned forward, her hand brushing the back of his dot. He turned his palm upward, revealing the tattoo she hadn't yet seen, fresh and still healing. A book unfurling into birds, flying upward. Beneath it, "You were the silence I could breathe in." She traced it gently with her fingertips. "I read your poem the night you returned," she whispered. "The one about finding home." Dante nodded. "It was always here. I just needed time to believe I deserved it." The quiet wrapped around them like a warm blanket, and Clara shifted closer until their knees touched. "I missed you," she said. "I missed us," he replied. And in that quiet corner of the library, between pages and paperbacks, they began the slow process of untangling everything left unsaid. No rushed promises, no dramatic declarations, just a steady, certain return of two people no longer running, no longer hiding, meeting again in the one place that had always accepted them. Beneath the ink, Chapter 15. The story they write together. Spring arrived gently in Mariner's reach, painting the town in soft pastels and new beginnings. The air carried the scent of salt and lilac, and the town square bloomed with life once more. And just beside the library, where ivy curled around the bricks like a story in motion, a new shop opened its doors. Ink and verse. The sign read in elegant, hand-painted script inside. The walls were lined with sketches and stanzas, Dante's tattoos framed like museum pieces, each one paired with a quote, a poem, or a memory. The scent of sandalwood lingered, mingling with fresh paper and ink. A small bookshelf in the corner held poetry collections and a guest book full of handwritten verses left by visitors. Next door, the library thrived. Clara had expanded the Poetry After Hours program, now a monthly tradition that drew students, retirees, and curious wanderers alike. She'd started a book club too, and a writing workshop for teens who preferred notebooks to noise. But the heart of it all, the quiet pulse that made the days feel soft and full, was them. Every morning, Dante brought Clara her favorite tea, still too hot to drink, and every evening he waited outside the library with a sketch or a poem he'd written between appointments. Their life together wasn't perfect. There were still whispers, still scars, but love had found a rhythm between the pages and the ink, the coffee spoons and the candlelight. It wasn't grand or loud, it was steady, rooted, real. One Sunday afternoon, the town held a small arts festival in the square. Locals gathered beneath string lights and linen tents, browsing handmade crafts, listening to live readings. Clara stood on a makeshift stage, microphone in hand, the breeze tugging at the hem of her dress. She opened her well-worn copy of Dante's notebook, the one he'd finally let her keep, and read his poem aloud. She didn't ask me to change. She simply made staying soft feel like survival. And that's how I knew I was home. When she looked up, Dante stood at the edge of the crowd, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, watching her with the kind of expression that said everything without saying a word. Later, as they walked home hand in hand, their fingers interlaced, Clara glanced up at him. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" she asked. "No," he murmured, "but I hoped." And as the sky turned lavender and the town fell into its familiar hush, Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, smiling. Not every love story needed a dramatic twist. Some just needed a library, a bit of ink, and the courage to begin again. Together, they had written something lasting, a story beneath the ink and beyond it.